All right, all you people over here. Today I want to talk about ex-Kiss record producers Kenny Kerner and Richie Wise, who had some interesting things to say about the individual band members, including some not so nice things. I think you're gonna dig this one, so stick around, cause Cat Stanley Space Demons coming at ya! Right on! Okay, so when Kenny Kerner first met his future music production partner, Richie Wise, the pair were both a couple of aspiring young musicians living in the Flatbush section of Brooklyn in New York City. Now, Kerner didn't play a musical instrument, but he was very adept at writing song lyrics, and he had a knack for the business aspect of rock and roll. Also, being a couple years older than most of the young guys in the Brooklyn music scene, he wound up gravitating towards the management side of things. In fact, he assumed management duties of Richie Wise's three-piece hard rock and roll outfit called Dust. Now, that band's members included Wise on guitar, with whom Kerner wrote the group's songs. Also, future Super Session and touring player Kenny Aronson played bass, and on drums was a guy called Mark Bell, who'd go on to become Marky of the famous punk rockers, the Ramones. Now, the band would go on to record their self-titled debut for Neil Bogart's Kama Sutra Records in 1971. The album would do well in Midwest rock strongholds like Detroit and Cleveland, but Kerner and Wise weren't happy with that album's sound. They felt there were too many cooks in the kitchen in terms of production, and since they had written all the songs, they decided they were going to produce the band's follow-up album themselves. Now, released in 1972, Dust's second album, Hard Attack, would go on to chart in Cashbox, Billboard, and Record World. Neil Bogart was so impressed that he called on the duo to begin producing pop records for Kama Sutra. The pair would go on to have a lot of chart success producing for the label, including the Billboard #1 single, Brother Louie. You might remember that one. Louie, 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 Louie. It was by a group called Stories in 1973. I know you guys love my singing. So when Neil Bogart started his Casablanca Records label and signed on hard rockers Kiss, Kerner and Wise seemed like the natural choice to produce the band's 1974 self-titled debut album. In fact, it was Kerner who had encouraged Bogart to sign Kiss after listening to the reel-to-reel demo tape the band had submitted to the label. He loved the band's sound, which he referred to as being real raw and real street. And of course, Kerner and Wise would not only go on to produce that first Kiss album, but the group's follow-up record, Hotter Than Hell, as well. But as for that first album, Kiss's self-titled debut, which was released on February 8th, 1974, they recorded it at Bell Sound Studios in New York City. It took just 13 days. And this is what Kenny Kerner had to say about that recording process. He said back in 2003, the band was totally together. Nothing was written in the studio. They played everything live. The guitar solos were overdubbed and the vocals were overdubbed. Richie Wise basically reiterated those same points and had this to say: as a producer, I was involved with every aspect of Kiss's songs, starting with choosing the songs, the arrangements, and the recording. I don't think there were any major changes to any of the Kiss songs. I did guide the group in rearranging the early songs from the original demos done by Eddie Kramer and getting them into tighter shape, more into 3 or 4 minute jobs. And I think one of the things that they did do, they truncated the solo section on Firehouse, which if they always played live, the solo was always longer. If you go back to that original first Kiss album, is a shorter solo section on the recording. But anyways, he said, the group knew the songs pretty well, and we would make changes on the fly before we recorded them. They wanted to keep it raw. Okay, so let's get into what these two guys had to say about the individual band members in Kiss. We'll start with Richie Wise. He had this to say about Paul Stanley. He said, Paul was always very exciting. He had that Steve Marriott energy. Paul wanted to be the greatest rhythm player like Pete Townsend. He was a nice, solid rhythm player. Of course, he's talking about Steve Marriott, frontman from Humble Pie. Pete Townsend, of course, from The Who. And then he goes on to say this about Gene Simmons. The person I thought that was the best in the band was Gene. Gene was an exceptional bass player. You hear that, Susie Quattro? An exceptional bass player. He says, I found his lines to be very, very musical. He also really had that attitude with his singing. And then he says this about Ace. He says, Ace was a very solid guitar player. Didn't have a lot of tricks up his sleeve, but what he did extremely well. Now, as for Peter Criss, seems like he has some pretty positive things mostly to say so far about the band members, but he saves the kicker for Peter Criss, the Catman. Here's what he says. In hindsight, Peter Criss was pretty terrible. At the time, I thought he was okay. He was not from the John Bonham or AC/DC school. Therefore, the group didn't have that rock drum groove thing happening. Peter was a really good guy. I remember liking him a whole lot. In hindsight, he was very lucky to have been in that band, and I think Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons would tell you the same thing. Hey, Peter was lucky to be in our band. You got lucky, babe. You got lucky, Peter, when Gene and Paul found you. Anyways, I know how much you love my singing, so I got to go off for a second every now and again. But okay, one other thing Richie Wise had to say about Peter Criss with regards to the song Black Diamond. He says, Black Diamond was Peter's Ringo cut. As a singer, Peter had pitch problems up the ass. But Peter had a great gravelly sound that was heartfelt. And then he says this about Gene and Paul. He says, Gene and Paul were pretty much on the money with their vocals in the studio. I remember that Paul tried to hit some real high notes and harmonies. We probably slowed the tapes a few times to make it easier for him to get those high notes. So here it sounds like they cheated a little bit so Paul could hit those high notes on that song Black Diamond. So that's Wise's take on the Kiss band members. Let's get to Kenny Kerner's take. Of course, the band would go on to record their second album just 10.5 months later. They moved to Los Angeles at the behest of Kerner and Wise. Of course, Casablanca Records headquarters were out there, so they recorded the album at Village Recorders in Los Angeles. And here's what Kenny Kerner had to say about the Kiss band members. Paul really worked hard on being a real good singer and a good performer. Gene worked on his bass playing and was very conscious of what he played. Sometimes Peter had a timing problem. He worked on that and didn't do anything incredibly complex. He played for the song, not how many fills he could do. They all played for the song. Nobody did anything to show off in that band. Ace had no problems playing at all and had a great sense of humor. Now listen to this, what else he has to say about Ace. He says, and this is in regards to Ace Frehley, he probably was the most talented. So Kerner says he thought Ace was the most talented. Wise said he thought Gene was the best in the band. Neither one of them had great things to say about Peter. And then he goes on to say, Kiss were mediocre musicians, but to become successful, you don't have to be an Eric Clapton on guitar or a Ginger Baker or a Jack Bruce. And then he goes on to laud Kiss for their determination, stick-to-itiveness, the excitement they brought to rock and roll. And he says they gave the people something to believe in, and they extended the myth of rock and roll, and that goes beyond talent. So there you have it. Kenny Kerner and Richie Wise's assessments of the individual band members in Kiss. This kind of as a postscript. I thought this was interesting. Back in 2003, Gene Simmons had this to say about Kenny Kerner. He said, Kerner wasn't, he said, Kenny Kerner was not really producing. He was involved more with taking care of the business side of it. He was really the one who had the passion for the band. Richie Wise had been in the group Dust and was a songwriter himself and had never made it. In some ways, we just sort of went along with his perception of what we should and what we shouldn't do. But in essence, we recorded the songs as they were written. So he talks about how Richie Wise never made it. And let me know what you guys think. Kerner and Wise produced the first 2 Kiss albums, their assessments of the individual band members. But as far as what's his nuts assessment, Peter Criss, he's entitled to his own opinion. As far as Peter not having the John Bonham or the AC/DC rock and roll groove. But Peter had his own groove. He had the jazz swing thing happening, and he's really the one that gave those early Kiss songs that signature sound. And those early Kiss records were so influential to so many drummers. Look to Peter Criss as being a very influential drummer. And, those tracks, as great as a drummer as a guy like Eric Carr, maybe more technically proficient, a better quote-unquote rock drummer. But Peter Criss had what it took to make those early Kiss records swing and give them that signature sound. All of those classic tracks that we still listen to this day. Peter Criss was the backbone of those tunes. So whether or not he was a John Bonham or a Phil Rudd type of player, Peter Criss did what he did, and it worked for Kiss. Gene and Paul have even said as much in hindsight. So gotta disagree with him on that one, but of course he worked with the band and he's entitled to his opinions. What do you guys think? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think they're spot on? Do you think they're full of you-know-what? As always, let me know what you think. Hope you dug the video, and we'll see you next time.
Who's here?